I'm mindful of the Rick Hills precedent, and maybe I should just be quiet. But I do want to say a few things which have to go with respect to your paper, apropos of what? Why did you write this? It does appear maybe to be mostly about my friend Michael here, but really my concern is broader. I've had people along the way tell me a number of things that I could probably relate. It might save at least a little time in the discussion. One of them is that Michael's article, kind of a marvel of a law review article, is still relevant, but Michael wasn't doing original meaning, and therefore his paper, his conclusions were of limited relevance today. But I never thought that was right, since quite a few prominent original meaning theorists, that is, new originalists, keep citing his work as relevant. Obviously, they think it's sort of translatable into original meaning, even if he wasn't complying with all of the bells and whistles, interpretation, construction, fixation, and constraint, and so on. The other thing I heard a lot was, put politely, Professor Calabresi, who I've never met, is kind of an outlier, perhaps among originalists, but I think it's evident that Professor Calabresi, for any advantages or faults, is sincerely trying to follow the tenets of the new originalism. And if that leads him in a certain direction, we can then appreciate better what the theory amounts to by what he comes up with. So I still think both are relevant. Another specific origin from this project was listening to Akhil Amar. For many years, I'd only met him briefly, but he agreed to address my seminar a few years ago. And the women students in the seminar pressed him on the idea that the 14th Amendment, as originally adopted, was very helpful to women's rights. And he began to kind of harangue them, and he kept repeating 14 plus 19 equals the ERA. Now, I know what he meant at the time, and I certainly support what Reva Siegel calls synthetic interpretation, the idea that when you adopt the 19th Amendment, in effect, you have to go back, arguably through the entire text, and see how the adoption of this new text might have changed your perspective on everything that happened before. And I think that has a lot to it, but I just don't see American lawyers doing that. That doesn't, to invoke the spirit of our law for a second, that doesn't seem to be how we do our law. But if the reasonable conclusion is that, from that, would be the Reconstruction amendments were not necessarily viewed by their adopters as changing everything that came before, and that the interpretive situation of the so-called second founding was fundamentally different from the 18th century. Not writing on a blank slate. Even some people say about the 18th century that it's not year zero. They weren't writing on a blank slate, but it's for sure that the framers of the Reconstruction amendments had unanticipated difficulties, perhaps, in integrating these new texts, and certainly judges did, when taking into account important doctrines like federalism and separation of powers. It's therefore of some concern to me that the new originalism, both as theoretically presented and as practiced, doesn't seem to allow much free play for these centrally important doctrines. And that's one of the things that led me to be critical of Michael's paper, not necessarily right away, but one of my ideas was I would review all of the historical scholarship on Reconstruction that had been published since Michael's article and see if it made a difference. And as I recount, I think it makes some difference. Now, my fundamental concern in my work is with constitutional change, both formal and informal, how to understand the interaction between them. I think just as a general comment, that this paper reflects, I think we have to keep the book straight. And the best way to keep the book straight is, in effect, to start at the most specific level. And in terms of debates over originalism, this, of course, means that it might look like you're reintroducing a host of difficulties that have to do, that went under the rubric of expectations and so on. I always thought that was an overly simple debate. I hope in the paper I gave you some reason for thinking that you can't divide everything into, let's say, a distinction between the semantic meaning of the text and then just what they expected. There's a lot more going on, which would include purposes. That's a flashpoint for some, but also just the design elements that go into any collective effort. And once you take proper account of those, I think you're moving away from reality by not paying attention to things that they think they're doing and they're accomplishing with, let's say, the 13th Amendment, but also the things that they're reserving for the future. Now, in reflecting about how they seem to have taken up issues first of all, but then reserved issues for the future, that's how I came up with the idea for what I call the sequencing argument. This is simply a spin-off of some ideas I had. What if you applied Michael's method in his article to the earlier amendments? Suppose you generalized what he's doing, which is to say it's okay to take into account what happened or their views after something was passed, post-enactment history. What would happen if you did that for the 13th Amendment and so on? That made me think then that there was something to the idea that original meaning was leading us a bit down the rabbit hole. And what we needed is just a more robust approach that historians typically use. And that meant I had to define how historians are different from originalists, and I peg it on this self-understanding, which I haven't seen clearly before, except from some historians. Because originalism is often opposed to living constitutionalism, I just want to say something by way of distinguishing my own views from at least a fairly popular take on living constitutionalism, even though this may be sort of orthogonal to what's going to happen. I suggest a relatively neutral criterion for understanding who is a living constitutionalist in American history. They are people who don't believe that Article 5 is that necessary for making fundamental changes, because the Constitution pretty much answers all the value questions, value challenges that come along that we might want to pose. And so such changes can and typically are made from this point of view through non-Article 5 processes. Now, David Strauss is a really good example of what I'm talking about. Some of you might be familiar with his article, The Irrelevance of Constitutional Amendments. From my blinkered point of view, this is one of the worst articles ever written because it doesn't acknowledge the fact that sometimes you can only do things through an amendment, something which places me a little more on the side of where originalists are typically coming from. But I see some aspects, at least, of American history as more of a tragedy than something as if we've always been able to cope with our challenges. Not necessarily. Sometimes we, in effect, have to make what amount to perhaps Article 5 level changes. But we don't have the recourse of Article 5. I think Professors McGinnis and Rappaport are quite on point in emphasizing the interaction between how often we choose to use Article 5 and then what we do through the judiciary. I would draw different conclusions than they do. But notice that by my criterion, many of the 19th century abolitionists who were in effect pro-Constitution, okay, this is not Garrison, this is the people opposed to Garrison. They view the Constitution as fundamentally anti-slavery in light of the Declaration. But they're pro-Constitution. These are proto-living constitutionalists. You're looking at proto-living when you look at them, because they don't want to concede that changing the Constitution is necessary. Now, part of what happens then after that is an interaction between people who are just convinced we don't need to change the Constitution and then gradually being forced to change it. But once they do, we need to accept that sometimes what they did went so far but not far enough from our point of view. I think I'm supposed to say I'm looking forward to Michael's comments, but not so much.